ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
When you're little, if you've grown up with a dad around the house, you tend to have a vague idea of what it is that he does for a living. Dad gets up in the morning, puts on the appropriate gear, goes out into the mysterious adult world, does whatever he does, and comes back home at the end of the day. Well, Peter Norris's dad kept irregular hours. He'd either be around all the time, when he'd be a loving father as best he could with Peter and his siblings, or Dad would be gone for months and months, and Peter would go into foster care. And then his dad would suddenly reappear and take Peter off to a new place. And that's because Peter's dad was Clarence Clarry Norris, a wanted criminal. But being a little kid, it took Peter a long while to realise that. Clarry was forever breaking out of custody, and when he did, the first thing he wanted was to have his kids around him. And so he took Peter with him from place to place right across Australia. Clarry could be a violent man, but he was surprisingly loving and tender with Peter. And after Peter's mum left the picture, Clarry tried to fill the role of mother and father to him, so much so that Peter says he entered his dad, a criminal on the run, in a Mother of the Year competition. Peter's memoir of his childhood on the run is called The Bank Robber's Boy. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for having me.
How was your dad with you and your older siblings when you were little? What's your earliest pictures of him? What does he look like to you when you try and remember his face leaning over you?
Yeah, that's an easy one. He was always a very loving and supportive father, which is sometimes hard for people to understand given some of his background, his violence and his crimes. But for us as kids, not knowing any different, he was just a really loving, protective and supportive dad.
Was he strict, or did he tend to let just things happen? The kids run a little bit wild.
No, he was strict. He was quite strict. We knew what we could and couldn't get away with. Didn't sort of push past those boundaries too many times, and we knew the consequences. So I think, tried to ensure that we didn't end up like him.
What were your memories of your mum like?
I don't have any memories of my mum. I rely on my brother, who's 7 years my senior, to tell me a few things about her. But she caught a bus one day, said she was going shopping, and that was the last we saw or heard of her, so to this very day.
How were you told that your parents were breaking up?
The story goes that, Mum and Dad were having some problems. Mum actually had a new boyfriend. This was around when I was about 18 months old, and Mum and Dad had shared custody, and Mum was dating some ex-commando, Tim, big tough character, and as Dave tells it, Dad went around there one day with a tomahawk and knocked the door in and some of Tim's skull with it, and then brought the family back together. Mum was sort of dragged back into the family home. So
against her will?
Well, yeah, Dave tells it that she came home and was sad and then sort of developed a bit of a drug habit after that time. So I can imagine why she might want to depart that situation. It probably wasn't very safe and supportive for her.
So your mum left the picture and you never saw her again. And then your dad was arrested. So where were you kids put after your dad was arrested?
Yeah, we spent a short time with my grandfather and grandmother, who were my mum's foster parents, actually. It wasn't sort of too long after Mum departed and Dad was sent to jail that we were taken to a local Seventh-day Adventist church. We were separately given out to different families from that church. So I went off with a family, and my two sisters went their separate ways as well. And my brother remained with Grandma and Grandpa.
So your earliest memories then would be of growing up in this foster family from the Seventh-day Adventist church?
Yeah, and they were the Robinsons. So, my first memories are with this family who I thought were my biological family. And there was just a couple of instances along the way where I started to question that.
And what were those instances?
There was one particular evening I used to get blood noses all the time. I was one of those kids whose nose would just bleed. And one evening my nose bled and I bled onto the pillowcase and the sheets, and there was obviously blood everywhere. And Dad, or the person I thought was Dad at the time, came in and gave me this sort of quite brutal strapping across the legs, the back of the legs, and I was really upset. And anyway, the next day, I really started to question whether I belonged, and it was just this really sense of I don't belong here. And I started to look at my surroundings, at Mum and Dad and my two siblings, my two brothers, and everybody looked different than me. I was quite tall and thin with this dark sort of mop of curly hair, and they were all round, short with sort of red, straight hair.
So they had natural-born kids?
They had natural-born kids.
And how did they introduce you when they were introducing the kids as a whole?
I was never really introduced as their child. It was just, and it was only on reflection that I picked this up, that they would kind of introduce their two biological sons and then go, oh, and this is Peter. So I really started to question where I belonged, and to the actual point of I went to kindergarten one day, and I said to my teacher, I said, I just don't feel like I belong. I'm searching for my real family. And she kind of thought that was quite bizarre, but I was really certain that I belonged elsewhere.
And when did you realise that this was actually true?
There was one morning, and we were heading off to church, actually. Yeah, Mum was cutting roses off the rose bush, and I was always an active kid, which again was very different than my siblings. I was sitting inside and watching TV, and I was always just circling the backyard or the front yard. On this occasion, I was just running laps around the front yard, and I heard the gate open. There was a little squeak, and looked around, and there was a man coming towards me, really kind of large, quite, muscular man, and he had the biggest smile on his face and his arms out. And I didn't even exchange a word at that stage, and I just knew, and that was Dad, who'd I learnt later on had spent the last 18 months in court, so doing the right thing at this stage, and getting his kids back together. So he'd come to pick me up.
Who was in the car when he put you in the car with him when he came to pick you up?
Yeah, so he picked me up, and there was obviously an exchange of conversations between somebody who was there, whether that was a social worker, I'm not sure, but all the formalities, and I was just in a state of happiness. And Dad took me back to the car, and there was two faces pressed up against the glass, giggling and cheering, and there was two young girls. And as I got in the car, I was introduced to my sisters, Tina and Kelly.
And did they look like you?
They did, actually. Yeah, very, which is very different to what I'd been used to.
It's kind of like a dark fairy tale, this one, in a way. It's because it feels like I know my parents, these people who are calling themselves my parents aren't my parents. And then suddenly they're all there. The family is there. Yeah,
and quite strange as we drove to our house, to the house that Dad had organised. I was meeting my sisters, meeting my real family, and they were telling me their stories about where they'd been, and we were all... And it just felt like a family. It was quite surreal.
And when he took you to this house with you and your sisters, was he kind to you?
He was really kind. The first thing I noticed when we walked in was that my room, I had a bed, had somewhere to sleep, obviously, but their rooms look established.
So they'd been with him for a while before they picked you up?
They'd been with him a while, so he just hadn't quite got me over the line legally to come and get me. So, but he'd got the two girls back before me, so... Yeah, an amazing feeling just to feel at home. We sort of had a lot less than I'd had with the Robinsons. We didn't have any toys, but it didn't matter. It just felt like home.
So this is when he became like a father and mother to you, you say, and you entered him into this competition. Tell me about this.
Yeah, that was a bit later in life. We were on the run at that stage, actually, and it was one of my sisters and I, we hatched this plan that Dad had been a really good mum and dad to us. So there was this... Mother's Day competition in Perth, WA's best mum. So we wrote this letter, entered that, and just obviously didn't think much of it. And anyway, the press came around and wanted to take photos, and we'd won this weekend away.
You won the competition?
We won the competition.
Your dad became WA's, this newspaper's Mother of the Year?
He became WA's Mother of the Year, and he was on the run. So he was quite annoyed at first because there was press coming around taking photos. He was on the front page of the the main WA paper. So I don't know how we got away with that. So we went and spent a weekend at this palatial hotel, picked up in a Rolls Royce, and we had this weekend, which was just crazy. But yeah, Dad got over it eventually.
So I've seen that photo of you you and your dad in front of that Rolls Royce.
Yeah, I've got my school pants on. I've got grey school pants on. We had nothing else to wear. But
your old man must have been laughing his head off that this was happening.
He was laughing afterwards once he got over the shock of being on the front page of the paper.
As Mother of the Year.
As Mother of the Year.
A wanted criminal.
As a wanted criminal. So it was just one of those stories that's crazy. We had conversations about him being on the run, but as kids we just didn't click that being on the front page of the paper is a bad idea. So
when you were as little, when he'd picked you up from the Robinsons and took you back to this house, tell me how you and your sister found his stash at the top of the wardrobe.
Yeah, Dad was having a sleep one day actually, and it was nearly Christmas, and we decided we'd go looking for presents to see what we were getting. You know, as kids, we all go searching for the hidden presents.
Yeah, I used to do that too.
Yeah. Anyway, so we got a chair, and we thought the cupboard in Dad's room was probably a good spot to start, obviously. So we got on top of a chair and got to the top of the cupboard, and there was some blankets and things that were pushed up, and we thought maybe there was something hiding behind that, so we pulled them out. And, there was a brown bag, actually several brown bags. We pulled them out and looking for our presents, and opened some of the bags, and most of them were filled with cash and just bundles of cash all tied up in rubber bands. And then one of the bags, there was pistols, two pistols in one of the bags. So, we panicked. Dad sort of started to stir, and he yelled out, "What are you kids up to?" So we quickly put that back and ran down and just sat with him, pretended we'd just been playing hide and seek or something.
That bag implies that he'd been involved in armed robbery. Were you old enough to put those facts together in your head?
Yeah, it was about this time that we started to realise that Dad probably wasn't just a cleaner. He had told us, that he was just a cleaner, so he'd got jobs at local hospital and schools and all those sorts of things, and that he was really just trying to be a dad. But as at this point that we realised, maybe things were maybe a little bit different for us.
How did you then come up with your first break and enter scheme for yourself, Peter?
Yeah, this is and it's hard to think that a 6-year-old's capable of a break-in. Most 6-year-olds these days are struggling to even tie their shoelaces sometimes. But I had noticed that Dad's mood had changed for the worse. I think at this stage he was really trying not to be a criminal. He wanted to be on the straight, I believe, and he couldn't afford just the basic groceries. We were going to the Salvation Army for food and clothing, and the Smith family. And Dad was just always irritable and angry, and was sort of one day I said to my sisters, I said, we need to help here. And I'd seen enough by the age of 6 to know or to think that if you needed something, you stole it. That's kind of all I'd seen. I didn't really know any different. So, I hatched this plan to break into the local high school, which we did, and stole, just money and jewellery and anything that the teachers or the staff room had in it or anything we could find, and took that back to Dad.
And what did he say when you put your haul in front of him?
Yeah, it was that was also interesting in terms of the feedback or the perceived feedback. He said all the right things. We shouldn't do that. We'll end up in jail, blah, 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 all the things that a dad should say. But his mood changed. We noticed that, the next day he brought some groceries, and he was a little bit happier. So for me, I took that as just positive feedback, as in, okay, that's really helped our family. So it's something I should continue to do.
He couldn't afford to keep you. He, as you said, he was running out of funds all the time in an effort to try and stay on the straight and narrow. And in the end, he had to take you and your siblings to a place in Randwick in Sydney called Glenmervyn. Tell me about this place and what life was like there for you.
Yeah, for us, initially Glenmervyn was a little scary. It was this big sort of red brick building with dormitories, and there was a little classroom, and the routine was very tight. You got up at a certain time and you had breakfast at a certain time and you helped do the dishes and you made your beds and you went off to class.
And what did you think about that?
Look, it was a bit of a change initially, but as I found out after the first couple of days, I really, really, really enjoyed the routine and felt that was exactly what I needed.
This is such a common thing I found talking to people who had childhoods which were very turbulent or chaotic, and there was all sorts of stuff going on in the background. They kind of end up liking the routine and the safety of school or of an institution. And it sounds like it was the one institution in any case that made you feel safe and happy.
Yeah, and it was really, for 2 weeks at a time mostly. And I think, looking back on that and having conversations with my brother, that was when Dad would probably go off and commit most of his crimes, so certainly the higher risk ones where, in his mind, if things went wrong and he got caught, at least we were in a safe place. But for us, as you say, the routine, I just found that really, really, really enjoyable.
As his financial situation improved, he started taking you kids to the track with him, to the dogs, to the trots and to the races. Yeah. And they're like, what tended to happen when he dragged you to the track?
When Dad had money, the whole weekend consisted of racing of some sort, greyhounds and gallops and trotting races and everything. So what would happen, we'd enter the races and Dad would always just go, okay, I'll meet you back here after the last race.
When he'd just take off?
He'd just take off.
And how old are you kids when he's done these? Just dumped you in the crowd?
I was about 8 when this started happening.
But you had older siblings with you?
Had older siblings, but then we'd always, certainly I would, from that age of 6, having that first break-in, I was always out to try and make a buck.
Yeah, well, what were some of your money-making schemes at the track?
The races were easy for me. I would wait, and there was always a race from the bar out to the track just before the race started, that sort of 5 minutes before, when you get that sound that would indicate the race is 5 minutes away. And most of the men would leave their beers just where they were drinking them and race out, watch the race and come back. And so in that time, I'd collect all these sort of half-drunk beers in plastic cups, and I would make a little stall in a different location with full beers that I'd put together.
You were selling beer slops?
I was selling beer slops, yeah.
Could you make a living out of that?
I made a good living, I was only 20 cents a cup, but, most people would throw me a dollar for 2 or... So, I'd hand all that money to Dad at the end of the day and, just contribute. So I was always finding little schemes to make my own money.
Your dad could be a violent man, although he wasn't with you. But did you ever see him perpetrate acts of violence?
I saw a few, and there's probably the main ones I saw where it was on a day we were heading to the races, and he had this hot tip, which was often the case. We caught a taxi together, Dad and my 2 sisters and I, and Dad paid the taxi driver an extra $10 and said, "Get us there quick. I've got a bet I've got to put on." Anyway, the taxi driver did as asked, and he was swerving around corners and driving. And my sister, Kelly, would get car sick. So she kind of leaned across to Dad and said, "I don't feel so well." And he just went, "It's okay, I've got a bet to put on. Just lean back, we'll be there in a minute." We were pulling into the track, and Kelly, unfortunately, vomited all over the back seat of the driver's seat and onto the floor, and clearly something he was unhappy about. So he pulled up and started ranting and screaming at Dad to clean it up. Dad, who was clearly still focused on just getting into the track to put his bet on, tried to give the man a little bit of money, and he just ignored that and said, "You need to clean it." And he just kept going on and on. Anyway, Dad asked us to get out of the taxi, which we did. And this man was still, ranting and screaming. So Dad just walked around to the taxi driver's side and just landed, one punch to the taxi driver, whose head straight away just went straight onto the steering wheel and onto the horn. Like you sort of see in a movie, there was just that head on the steering wheel and the horn just blasting, and Dad just grabbing us by the hand and, with a smile on his face going, "Okay, kids, let's go."
Were you frightened by that, or did the fact your dad was happy, did that make it okay?
No, it didn't. And this was probably one of the first moments where, for the first few hours after that, I couldn't stop thinking about the poor driver. and I was starting to feel like maybe I was a little bit different than Dad. I got no enjoyment out of that at all. And I kept looking back at the taxi driver wanting to go and help him.
During this time, your dad was teaching you to run. Like you said, you were running a lot and you're quite an athletic kid, and you're clearly an athletic man today as well. What was his training regime like for you?
Dad would make me eat raw eggs, which again was something, I don't know, they used to do back in the day.
You saw Rocky. That's from Rocky.
Probably
right?
is from Rocky.
Yeah,
He's watching too much TV.
Right. Right. He knocks out Apollo Creed, therefore it's got to work. It's a breakfast of champions, raw eggs, is it? How do you feel about eating raw eggs?
Oh, God, it's disgusting. But I did what I was told. I'm not sure whether it was raw eggs or just Dad just continuing to push me that you've always got more. So, when I thought I was done, there was always another lap or always another rep of sprints that was to be done. So
he entered you into this race, a 1,500-metre race. What happened on that day?
Yeah, I'd qualified through Little Athletics in Campbelltown. I'd qualified for a state title, and I'd had this feeling that I was nowhere near it. I was just a sort of a recreational runner with Dad, but Dad entered me into this state title. It was in Sydney. We turned up and I looked around at all the other runners who had coaches and these spikes, running spikes. And I didn't even have a pair of runners. I was in bare feet. Which was quite nerve-wracking. And, Dad just sort of looked at me and said, don't worry about what they've got. Just, the plan. And Dad had told me exactly how to run this race, and we'd been through it. Geez, we've been through it 100 times, I reckon, just waiting for this moment. And I did exactly as he said. I just kind of held back and sat behind the first two runners for most of it, just worked my way through the race and kept, as Dad had always said, keep a heap in the tank until the last sort of 200, 250 metres and then just give it everything, which I did. And actually one of the runners at the start line looked across at me and laughed because I had no shoes on. And that was the person I passed about 20 metres before the finish line to beat. So that was a pretty bloody rewarding experience.
Where did you place?
I placed first. Yeah, came first. Yeah, I had tears. Dad had tears. It was crazy.
But when you got home that night, your dad told you you were leaving town. You were leaving Sydney.
Yeah, just after the race, there was a lady that came up to Dad and I saw them talking and wasn't sure what had transpired in that conversation. Anyway, she'd offered to buy me a pair of spikes and coach me and get me into some real training. And he told me that story when we got home and I said, "What did you say, Dad?" And he said, I said, "We don't need any of that we're okay." And I was disappointed, but obviously, keen just to continue to train and run. The next conversation I had with him was, look, we need to pack up and leave. We're going to leave tonight. Basically, grab your necessities, which was always a backpack, and we're leaving again. So, yeah, quite disappointing.
Just like that?
Just like that. There was never any notice.
That night?
That night.
And so you got in the car and you drove off to where? We
drove off to a motel, actually, and just spent a few nights in there. So, and these were the moments that we didn't really understand. And obviously the heat, Dad was aware that the heat was on him. And he was clearly on the run at this stage. So just continued to move around.
So where did you go?
From there, ended up going off to sort of Bendigo and then Shepparton. Yeah.
So placed into emergency housing there, Salvos type housing in Shepparton.
Yeah.
This is when your dad was arrested.
Yeah, it was a Salvation Army respite centre, and there was about 8 sort of 2-bedroom units sort of lined up in a row in this complex, and we were given food and some clothing there too, which was nice, and was quite a peaceful time for a couple of days. And there was another resident there who was a really large, tattooed man, and there was always this yelling and screaming coming from his apartment. And he was in there with his wife, we believe, and Dad had felt like there was certainly some domestic violence happening in there, and he was always very protective of kids and women. So he intervened in that one day. This man come out of his apartment, his unit, and he was a huge man. Anyway, Dad and this man ended up in a fist fight. And we were watching this, and it ended up with this man ended up having sort of Dad's throat in his hands and looking at us as kids and saying, do you want your dad to die today? Now, as kids, you don't know whether that's going to happen or not. So it was quite a horrific experience to witness firsthand. There was an old man who lived in the same complex and never said anything and sat on his stool out the front of his unit and chain smoked menthol cigarettes. And without sort of any warning or any word, he picked up his stool and walked over and just crashed it across the back of this large man's head, which may be the only reason Dad survived that. The big man, he was unconscious and come to, and he made a threat to Dad that he was going to come back that night and kill Dad and his family, obviously us kids. Dad told us not to worry about it. We went to bed that night, all of us.
Very worried.
Very worried and nervous about what might happen. I think it was in the middle of the night, 2 or 3 a.m. by memory, that we heard the front door crash in, thinking it was this large man coming to get us.
And who was it?
A squad of detectives come in yelling and screaming and told Dad to get down. By the time I'd come to and woke up, Dad was already on the ground with detectives pinning him down.
Did he tell you anything before he was dragged off?
It was always the same thing. Message from Dad was that I love you and whatever it takes, I'll be coming back to get you.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Richard Fiedler.
So when the police came and dragged your dad off that day out of that emergency home in Shepparton, had that fat man informed on him, or just was he being busted for the fight, or was he being busted as a wanted criminal? And can you even know that, I suppose? Because I'm just remembering you're looking at this as a kid and you don't even know, do you, I suppose? No. I remember being told at the time by the old man who'd helped Dad the day before that they felt that the large man had called the police. He'd somehow known that Dad was on the run. So I'm not sure whether that's actually fact or just a story, but there was a feeling that large man was involved in Dad's apprehension at that time. All you can know as a kid is what the grown-ups tell you, isn't it? And there's no Google or anything at that point in your childhood. Not
at that point in time, no. You couldn't look it up. We only had to rely on those around us.
So what about you and your siblings? You're still quite young kids. What happened to you after your dad was dragged off?
Yeah, we were taken into custody, and then my elder sister Tina, she had a local family who were friends, and she was permitted to go with them, which was great for her. It was a nice, safe environment for her. My sister Kelly and I, we were made wards of the state. So a lot of people have problems with the government, or bad things to say, but try having them as your parents. It's not, they don't always make great decisions for us either. So we were made state wards, and at the time we had a social worker who said that they're going to try and find us somewhere to live, and as it turned out, they couldn't at that moment. So we were at Shepparton Police Station when there was a female officer came into the room that we were waiting in, and she was crying as she came in and said, we have nowhere for you to go, and a decision's been made to send you to youth detention centres. And she was just beside herself, saying that she wished she could take us home, but she couldn't.
What was this youth detention centre you were put into? Yeah,
I was put into Baltara Youth Detention Centre, which is basically a jail for kids who had performed criminal acts and in the eyes of the law deserved to be in there.
But you were an abandoned child.
Yeah.
Is the stigma of your father's criminal history constantly visited on children, like Dad's no good and you're no good? Is that a constant theme?
Yeah, it is a constant theme, particularly through my childhood. Obviously managed to escape it through adulthood, but through childhood there was always that stigma that, the kids are probably no good, the old man's no good, so it must be the same.
We now know these homes were often extremely dangerous for children and put them at terrible risk of violence and sexual abuse. I expect that was your experience too, Peter.
Yeah, there was 3 specific moments through that time there that ticked all of those boxes. I was there for about 4 months, and certainly 4 months I sort of try to push aside. But and one of the reasons I wrote the book was to help bring some of this to life. There's lots of other reasons, but one of them is there's lots of people that experienced some of those horrific crimes. And I want them to know also that it's okay.
At the hands of other boys or of the staff, or both?
Both. Yeah, I mean, there was one particular instance. There was a swimming carnival, and being a sporty kid, I loved the opportunity to compete. So I entered into some races, and we were just splashing around, afterwards. And one of the larger kids who was in there, I was only a 11-year-old boy at this stage. So one of the big 15-year-old kids thought it would be a fun idea to grab my head and hold me underwater. Now I could feel myself starting to lose consciousness, and you don't know any different when you're being held underwater. I thought I was going to die, so it was quite horrible. Just as horrible when he finally let me up for air. That the guards who were circling around the pool were just laughing at what was happening. And at that point that I just knew that there was no safety here. There was no one looking out for me. The state government, who were, my legal guardian, were not coming in to check that I was okay. There was no one coming in to let me know where my sisters were. There was no one letting me know how my father was. So there was 4 months of just not knowing anything, or knowing when that incarceration was going to end. As
an adult, you pursued the state government through the courts about this for compensation. Was that a lengthy process? Was there a ready admission that we did something really bad here, or was it not like that?
There's 2 parts to it. The fact that I was put into a youth detention centre just because I was an abandoned child. The excuse was given, and there's legislation that covers it now, is that that's just the way things were done back then.
When was it okay to treat an abandoned child as a hardened criminal and put them in that kind of an environment? That was never okay, I don't think. I don't think that was that's what ought to be done.
No, it was never okay, and I don't think, 1985, just because it's 1985 means it's okay. And as you say, I don't believe there's ever a time when that's okay. But they've covered themselves on that front. And this is only in 2024 that I went to a hearing over this, and but the issues that they did have to face were those of sexual and violent matters that were committed against me.
How willing were they to hear your story?
I was advised that I was allowed to prepare and present an opening statement, which I did. I put a lot of time into, put a lot of heart and soul into, and there were tears preparing that statement. There was lots of things that I wanted to say. So I attended the hearing in Melbourne, and there was the state's representatives, their legal team and their insurers were present. They were handed my statement and then came back into the waiting room where I was with my legal team, and was told that they would not hear that statement and that they did not want to expose their staff to hearing that, and cited work health safety reasons for not wanting to hear it.
The state eventually pulled you out of Baltara and put you with a couple called Tim and Helen. But you must have been wondering where your dad was and what was happening to you there. What did they tell you about where your dad was?
That was really part of the confusion. I was told nothing. I was told after I was put out of Baltara that he was in WA at the time, so he was in prison in Fremantle.
But he wasn't in Fremantle, was he?
No, he wasn't. He was for a while, but as he always did quite well, he kept his promise to get out and come and get me again. So,
how did he come back into your life?
I was at a shopping centre actually with Tim and Helen and their kids, and in the distance I saw a man walking in the other direction, and it was Dad's walk. I could swear that was Dad, and I started running towards this man, and I was quite hysterical. And Tim just pulled me back and told me to stop being an idiot and embarrassing him and his family in the shopping centre. And I was crying uncontrollably, saying, "But that's my father." They just shook me off and drove me back to the car and took me, back to their home. As it turned out, that night there was a tap on my window, and it was in fact Dad that I'd seen. he was out and he'd come looking for me and somehow found where I was. So, I jumped out the window and we were off again.
That night?
That night.
So had he escaped from Fremantle Prison?
He'd escaped from Fremantle Prison, yep.
Where did he take you? Because you're in Melbourne at this point, aren't you?
We're in Melbourne at this stage, right. Yep. So I'd gone straight out of Baltara in Melbourne into a foster family in Melbourne. So he had a car waiting. He took me straight to a place called Gordon House, actually, just off Spencer Street.
Now, that in its day was kind of a notorious flop house.
Yes.
Which is, I think these days that whole area is actually a kind of a upmarket bar that's part of a luxury hotel, actually. But back in the day, it was a flop house. What are your memories of Gordon House, going in there with your dad?
Yeah, I remember walking in the front doors, and it was only Dad and I at this stage, and the person behind the counter just sort of looked at Dad and looked at me and just, and he was quite honest. He said, "This is no place for a kid, mate." And Dad just sort of ignored that. And the place just really smelt. There was lots of men. It was really all men.
It smelled of old man's piss, did it, pretty much?
It did. Yeah, it just smelled of old man's piss, to be honest. Yeah, and it was quite, it just got up your nose, and it was really a strong, just a strong memory.
They must have had to sandblast the walls in order to renovate that place.
To turn it into a luxury hotel and bar. I'm not sure there would have been a lot of work in that.
Were there any other kids there, or just you?
I did not see any other kids there at all. What it looked like was just lots of homeless men just sort of down on their luck or whatever else.
But how happy was he to see you?
Oh, Dad was, ridiculously happy. So for him, it was just, getting his boy back.
But he pulled you out of the house and into a flop house.
Yep.
He couldn't work because he was on the run.
No.
But that meant you had to get a job as a paper boy in the CBD of Melbourne. You were one of those kids selling the Melbourne Herald back in the day.
I was.
Shouting at Herald, right. That was
correct,
I remember them.
In the steps of Flinders Street Station. Yeah, found my spot there and shared that with another man who sold papers. So we had a little disagreement, but found our way together, and we shared the spot, and made good money, which I was able to hand back to Dad at the end of every shift.
Then you came up with a scheme, or maybe it was your dad that came up with a scheme to pinch money at the Melbourne Baths that's up there near the State Library on Swanston Street.
Yes.
How did that work?
Yeah, that was Dad's idea. As usual, he felt it was time to move again, and that we needed some money. The newspaper money was okay for day to day, but it wasn't enough to certainly to escape Melbourne. So we'd been in there once and had a look, and Dad had showed me that most of the suits, the businessmen in Melbourne would go there at lunchtime and swim some laps, and they'd have a towel sitting there with their little locker key tag hanging off it. And then if I was quick enough, I could just rip that tag off, walk into the men's bathroom, open the lockers and remove all the wallets, which I did. I was just watching, each man watch where they'd leave their towel, and as they were swimming in the other direction, just rip the tags and do exactly as Dad said.
How much money did you bring in from that?
That one was over $1,000 at the time, which was a lot of money.
This is the mid-'80s we're talking about.
Mid-'80s, yeah, which was a lot of money. I just had the wallets and put them in a little backpack and walked straight out the door.
And then you were off again, all of a sudden?
Yep, back on the road again, as was usually the case.
Where to this time?
Yeah, this time Dad felt it was we probably needed to get further away from Victoria and New South Wales. That was sort of where most of his crimes were committed and where he was, in his eyes, was most wanted. So had a vehicle, and we decided we were going to take a journey across a Nullarbor Plain to WA.
Going across the Nullarbor Plain, this is where you asked him to tell you a story of how he'd actually gone about an armed robbery.
Yeah.
What do you remember of what he told you about that?
Yeah, I was becoming a little more inquisitive about his lifestyle. And I was obviously, I was getting a bit older. I was still 11 at this stage, but well aware that Dad was a criminal. So we were just driving along, and, he gave me a driving lesson. And, obviously you've got a few days and nights travelling across there. So I asked him a question about, to tell me about one of his stories. And he proceeded to tell me about a bank robbery in Sydney that they'd planned and committed. And he told me about a security guard that was their biggest concern. It was a man that was well-trained, could defend himself, and they felt would be the biggest problem when they entered the bank. They knew exactly who was going to be on staff. It was Dad's job to subdue this particular guard to ensure that the rest of his crew could get the job done. So his dad tells me they went into the bank as they did with shotguns and balaclavas. Everybody did as they was told, and Dad went straight over to this guard, put a shotgun in his face and just said, "Get on your knees or I'll blow your head off." The man didn't move, just sat there staring at Dad, and Dad was sort of getting really frustrated with him and just repeated his comment, "Get on your knees or I'll blow your head off." And again, the man didn't move, and Dad at this point was just thinking the man was just defiant and going, "Oh, everyone's giving me the right intel, he's going to be a problem." But then he noticed that the man's eyes just really glazed over, and he looked down and the man was pissing himself at the same time. It was then that Dad realised that, he was really just gone into a catatonic state of some sort where he was just so frightened that he couldn't move.
And did your dad think that was funny? That he pissed himself?
He did. He was sort of had a bit of a laugh about it, sort of saying he wasn't so tough after all. And I just felt complete sadness. So as I'd done when I saw that taxi driver incident, I just felt a little ashamed. And it was just these little lessons that were piling up that were showing me that is not the life that I wanted. It just didn't feel right. I just felt this horrible dread and sorrow when hearing those stories. So certainly nothing funny about it for me.
So it's across the Nullarbor to Perth and then up to Port Hedland.
Yeah.
And you're missing out on all this school at this time too, aren't you? You're not really going to school at this period.
No, I'd completely missed grade 6 and year 7.
So in Port Hedland, you lied about your age and got you a job in Kmart. Because again, he couldn't get a job, and so it had to be you. Is there anything in your dad that's going, "I love my son dearly, but I've pulled him out of school. I'm living exploitatively off him, his wages, but this doesn't matter in the end so long as we're together as father and son"?
Yeah, I'm not sure. We never really had a conversation about how he felt about all that. I'm a father of 2 girls, so imagine if I was doing that to them, I would feel horrid. Not sure that he did. I think it was probably about survival. As an 11-year-old, I never felt it. And as you say, working at Kmart, under the guise of being a 15-year-old, my goal was just to work really hard, put my head down and take my weekly pay home to Dad so we could eat.
Maybe he needed you as a way for him to tell himself he was actually a good man underneath it all, because he could be a loving dad. Yeah. Despite all these heinous crimes he's committing. Yep. Nonetheless, I'm still a good man because I can be a loving father. Maybe that...
Yeah, maybe it was a bit of redemption in it for him, possibly. Just, trying to keep at least one of his children close.
So eventually he was arrested and found in Port Hedland and taken off to jail again. Where did you go after that? Yeah, after that I went into another respite home, and it was about this time that I realised, certainly I thought that adults weren't making the best decisions for me. So I decided to just grab my bag and leave that respite home and just live on the streets for a while I decided what was my next step. I felt I'll take adults out of the decision making for this stage. Where were you sleeping at night?
We're sleeping in Kings Park, actually. The weather in Perth is pretty good, so it wasn't too cold at nights. Just stealing milk and bread from the sort of early morning cafe deliveries. That's how we were eating most of the time. Stealing money when we could and sharing that amongst another little kind of social group of kids who were all living on the streets. Eventually you were put back into foster care with actually a really lovely family this time. This time it was different. Yeah. Who were this family and how were they with you? Yeah, this family, they were a farming family in a small town out of Shepparton in Victoria. So I was extradited back to Victoria as a state ward. For the first 3 weeks, I was permitted to live with my sister, and I just started breaking into houses again, just sort of following Dad's footsteps at that point. I was 13 years old. And, went to court, and I had a judge at that stage look me in the eye and just say, "You're the worst 13-year-old criminal that I've ever seen in my life. And it's up to you from this point forward what you do with that information." So I was put into a foster care home. It was only meant to be for 3 weeks. This beautiful family in the small town of Gagari. And in the first 3 weeks, I stole their car, pretty much did everything I could for them to push me away after the end of that 3 weeks. But the beautiful family they asked me to stay and offered me a lifeline with them and to get back into school and sport and all the things, just that routine that I so much desired.
Tell me how you were sitting watching TV with them one night and up came your dad's face on the TV.
Yeah, as far as I was aware, Dad was still in prison. He'd been apprehended, as we know, back in Perth and was back in Fremantle prison. We were watching a show called Australia's Most Wanted, and Dad was the number one featured criminal on that show, so quite a shock to me and the Dullard family.
They knew he was your father?
They knew he was my father, yeah. They knew exactly who he was. We wasn't aware at that stage that he'd already escaped. I had some visits from the police and social workers saying, we have no doubt that your dad's coming back to find you, which was always the case.
And was it the case?
It was the case. Every second weekend I was allowed to go and stay with my sister. And Dad had found himself in a little one-bedroom unit, not with her, obviously, in Shepparton. And when I'd go and visit Tina, we'd drive around the streets, and she'd make sure she wasn't being followed, and she'd drop me off to spend the weekend with Dad. So that happened sort of on and off for probably about 6 weeks.
How was he looking by then?
He'd certainly lost a lot of weight. I'd noticed that he looked a little gaunt at that stage. Seemed just a little bit more confused in his speech, and probably not the big, strong man that I had remembered. So, in a reasonably short time, to me, it looked like he was sick, but he assured me that he wasn't and that he was okay.
Did he ask you to come on the run with him again?
Yeah, he did. The expectation was just through the years that Dad would turn up and he'd say, "Radio Pete, here we go." I'd climbed out the window from foster homes. Every single time that, I had an opportunity, I rejoined him. On this occasion, he'd warned me on the previous visit the next time to bring some extra clothes, and I wasn't sure why, and, thought maybe we're just having a little adventure somewhere for the weekend, but I bought a bag of all my belongings, and we sat down on the couch, and he looked across at me and he said, "Right, Pete, it's getting a bit hot for me here in Shepparton and we're going to need to go." Initially, I didn't say anything. I just looked at him, and it was just this moment of silence. And I think he knew what I was thinking. I just looked at him and said, "Dad, I can't." And his face just dropped. I was crying. It was, the most difficult, even to this day, the most difficult decision I've made, because I wanted that. I wanted to be with him, but there was something I wanted more. And that was not to be him.
And you were with this lovely family for once.
Yeah. So, Dad walked out that day and never saw him again after that. And, went back to the family and back to school and started to live a normal life.
What became of your dad?
He eventually got caught again and got returned to Fremantle prison, where he got quite sick. So it was really early onset Alzheimer's. He was only in his 50s. He ended up dying in a prison hospital.
Did you imagine when you'd said, "No, I can't go with you on the road," that you would be able to reconnect with him at some point, or did you want nothing more to do with him at that point?
Oh, no, absolutely. In my head, that wasn't a final, "I'll never see you again" moment. That was I just need to get my life on track, Dad, and I'm sure, once you get yourself together and I'm an adult, that we'll reconnect again at some point. But, unfortunately, that wasn't to be. When
you said no to him, was he angry? Or could he, quote unquote, forgive you for your decision?
He wasn't. He definitely wasn't angry. He was clearly disappointed, and there was no more words spoken after that. He stood up and grabbed his belongings and just walked out the door. I could tell that he was deeply disappointed, and on reflection, every time that he had the opportunity to come and find me, he did. he always chose to come back. But this time I was choosing not to go with him, so I'm sure that was a tough one for him.
Now, many decades have passed. What perspective do you have on that now, Peter? It sounds like there's, the manner of your leave-taking of him, it wasn't intended to be that. It must have left feelings that, being unresolved between your father. But how can you resolve that kind of father-son relationship you have? What do you think about all that?
Look, it's a hard one to resolve. I still believe, and I strongly believe, that I made the right decision. My life today would suggest that I've made the right decision. I had no doubt that had I made the choice to go with him, that my life would have been very different today. Yeah, I've resolved that. Even knowing what I know now and how it ended for him, I still wouldn't have chosen to go with him.
And the family that had taken you in on that farm, what lasting impact have they had on you?
Just incredible. The whole family, my foster mother and father, Jack and Joan, had 6 biological siblings of their own, so quite a big family, and took me in as their 7th.
Did you like being part of a giant crew of kids?
Loved it, particularly on a farm where every day was, we're out riding motorbikes, we're out feeding cows, we're out playing football, cricket, swimming in the dam. It was just normal, for me, and it was routine. I had a bedtime. Again, we go back to that routine comment, Richard, where we go, it was, kids with that sort of a disruptive upbringing just crave that. So, and school. I loved going to school. I loved meeting friends at school and going to the movies with kids after school and just all the things that I hadn't experienced before. So, just really thrived in that environment.
So you decided you weren't going to be bent out of shape by what your dad was. What about him? Do you think he was a person who had been bent out of shape himself by his own childhood? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I know Dad spent a lot of his childhood in boys' homes, and some horrific things happened to him. Whether that was his choice because of those experiences or that his belief was that he knew no different. But my view is a little different in that despite those experiences, and I've had many of the same as him, that you still have a choice to choose your own path, and mine was never going to be the same as his.
It's a wild story. It's amazing to hear it, and thank you very much, Peter, for telling this story.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Peter Norris's book is called The Bank Robber's Boy. Today's conversation was created on the lands of the Gadigal, Turrbal and Jagera peoples. Producer was Mickey Morris, executive producer Carmel Rooney. I'm Richard Feidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Feidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.